I was just a boy from the gutters when they dragged me before the king. The stench of rotting leather and urine clung to my skin as I stood trembling, clutching my mother's cracked wooden flute, the only thing I had left of her. "Make the rat play, your majesty. It will be amusing," a nobleman shouted, triggering waves of laughter throughout the court. In that moment, I didn't know whether I would leave that castle alive. When I brought the flute to my lips, I played the only melody I knew, the lullaby my mother sang to me before she died. I closed my eyes, letting the notes carry me away from the mockery and hunger that defined my existence. But when I opened them again, the hall had fallen silent. The elderly priest had collapsed. The nobles stood frozen in shock, and the king was staring at me as though he'd seen a ghost. Something in my music had torn open a royal wound that had festered for 13 years. What I couldn't understand then was why my simple melody had such power, or why the king's trusted advisor would later slip into my chamber with a dagger, determined to silence me forever. The truth about my blood would change everything, but not in the way anyone expected. The stench of rotting leather and urine clung to Noam's skin as he stood trembling before the castle gates. Raindrops mingled with tears on his hollow cheeks, washing away streaks of dirt but failing to cleanse the despair etched into his young face. Just hours earlier, he had been dragged from the sewers by royal guards who found him stealing scraps from the castle kitchens. Now, rather than the dungeons, he faced something perhaps more terrifying: the mockery of nobility. The boy clutched a cracked wooden flute in his blistered fingers, the only inheritance from his mother, taken by fever 3 winters past. Her final words still haunted him: "This will feed you when bread cannot." He never understood what she meant until starvation forced him to play for copper coins at the marketplace. Today, however, was different. Today, he played for his life. The massive oak doors of the great hall creaked open, revealing a scene of opulence that made Noam's eyes burn with resentment. Nobles draped in silks and velvets lounged around tables laden with enough food to feed the entire slum where he slept. Crystal goblets caught the light from 100 candles, casting prismatic reflections across walls adorned with tapestries depicting heroic battles, victories celebrated by those who never bled. "Make the rat play, your majesty. It will be amusing," shouted a portly nobleman, wine spilling from his cup as he gestured wildly, triggering a wave of laughter throughout the court. Ladies with powdered faces hid their smirks behind ornate fans, whispering to each other as they appraised the filthy child with disgust barely concealed beneath curiosity. The king, a broad-shouldered man with a heavy gold crown that seemed to weigh upon his brow like a burden, looked up from his distracted conversation. His expression revealed nothing but boredom, the kind that comes from having everything yet finding satisfaction in nothing. With a dismissive nod, he ordered, "Put him on the stool in the center. Let us see what music comes from the gutters." Rough hands pushed Noam forward, his bare feet leaving muddy prints on the polished marble floor, evidence of his passage through this world of privilege, destined to be scrubbed away by servants once he was gone. The wooden stool felt like a scaffold beneath him, the eyes of the court like arrows piercing his dignity. Head bowed, matted hair falling across his forehead, Noam knew this moment would either destroy him completely or transform his life forever. Inside, his heart pounded like a terrified drum. The flute felt heavier than ever before, the instrument never meant for entertainment on command, especially not for those who saw him as less than human. But if he refused to play, he would be thrown back into the dark cell where rats gnawed at his toes while he slept, assuming he would even live to see morning. The choice was no choice at all. As he brought the flute to his cracked lips, an uncomfortable silence settled over the hall. Silver cutlery paused midway to mouths. Goblets remained suspended in air. The first breath into the instrument trembled, producing a wavering note that threatened to break like his spirit. Several courtiers exchanged amused glances, prepared for the mockery to begin in earnest. But the second breath emerged pure, carrying with it a melody ancient and sorrowful, weighted with inexplicable grief. The sound seemed to float above the feasting tables, weaving between candle flames and settling like mist around the hearts of all who heard it. This was not the crude entertainment they expected from a sewer child. This was a song that spoke of memories etched in blood and bone, passed down through generations, a lament that seemed impossible to have originated from the gutters. The melody flowed from Noam not as something learned, but remembered, as though his fingers knew where to move without instruction from his mind. Each note resonated with something primal and forgotten, echoing through the stone hall with increasing confidence. The boy's eyes remained closed, unaware of the changing expressions around him, contempt giving way to wonder, then to unease. It was then that Brother Elton, the elderly court priest who had been silently observing from the shadows, suddenly rose from his seat near the king. His wrinkled face had drained of all color, eyes widening with recognition. He swayed unsteadily, clutching at his chest as though struck by an invisible arrow. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words emerged. Only a strangled gasp that drew all eyes away from Noam. The ancient song. He managed to whisper before his legs gave way beneath him. The priest collapsed with a heavy thud against the stone floor, his frail body crumpling like parchment in flame. Servants rushed to his side while nobles backed away, crossing themselves in superstitious fear. Laughter died in throats. Goblets were set down with trembling hands. The hall plunged into a silence more profound than before, a silence thick with unspoken questions and awakened ghosts. Even the king had risen from his throne, his expression transformed from boredom to something far more complex. Recognition mingled with horror, as though confronted by a secret he had spent decades trying to escape. And Noam. Noam continued to play, eyes still closed, unaware that his melody had just ripped open a royal wound long festering beneath the crown. He remained lost in the only comfort he had ever known, music that carried him away from hunger, cold, and loneliness. His dirty fingers danced across the flute holes with unexpected grace, drawing forth sounds that seemed impossible from such a crude instrument. Only when the final note faded did he open his eyes, confused by the silence that greeted him instead of mockery. The king stood frozen, staring at the boy as though seeing a ghost incarnate. Their eyes met across the vast hall, one pair surrounded by gold and privilege, the other by dirt and desperation. For a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition that neither fully understood, but both instinctively feared. In that moment, Noam knew with absolute certainty that his life had irrevocably changed. Whatever happened next would set him on a path from which there could be no return. Toward salvation or destruction, he could not yet tell. But the melody had opened something that could never again be closed, unleashing secrets that had been buried beneath years of silence and shame. Brother Elton was carried hastily from the great hall, his frail body supported by two young acolytes. The elderly man's lips continued to move in silent agitation, and just before losing consciousness completely, he managed to whisper words that fell like stones into still water. That music belongs to the lost bloodline. The phrase cut through the king's composure like a blade against his throat. The banquet hall erupted into a storm of whispers. Noble women leaned toward one another behind cupped hands, eyes darting between their monarch and the filthy boy who remained perched on the stool, confusion written across his gaunt face. Knights shifted uncomfortably, hands instinctively moving toward sword hilts as though preparing for an unseen threat. The atmosphere had transformed from festive mockery to something dangerous, a court suddenly awakened to a mystery. Noam sat motionless, clutching his flute with white-knuckled intensity. He appeared even smaller now, more vulnerable beneath the collective gaze of the nobility. Yet something had changed. He was no longer merely a sewer rat dragged in for entertainment. He had become an enigma, a curiosity that demanded explanation. The very dirt on his skin seemed to take on new significance, as though it might be concealing something more valuable than common blood. From her elevated seat beside the throne, the queen observed the unfolding scene with rigid posture. Her slender fingers gripped the ornate chair arms with such force that her knuckles blanched white against her pale skin. Recognition flickered in her eyes, not of the boy himself, but of the melody that had flowed from his instrument. It was a song she had heard only once before, on a night she had spent decades trying to forget. Her gaze never left Noam, calculating and assessing with the precision of a master chess player contemplating an unexpected move. The king stood frozen for several heartbeats before recovering his composure. With a sharp gesture that brooked no argument, he commanded, "Take the boy to the eastern chamber. Post guards. No one speaks to him without my permission." His voice carried the edge of someone desperate to contain a wildfire before it consumed everything in its path. 2 armored guards yanked Noam from his stool, nearly causing him to drop his precious flute. They marched him through corridors of increasing opulence, past tapestries depicting royal hunts and victories, until reaching a small chamber tucked away in an isolated wing of the castle. Though modest by noble standards, it was grander than any space Noam had ever occupied. A bed with actual linens, a wooden table, and a single window too narrow for escape. The door slammed shut behind him, the heavy iron lock engaging with ominous finality. A suspicious steward stood guard inside while an armored soldier took position outside. Neither spoke to him, regarding the boy as one might view a dangerous artifact rather than a child. Hours passed without food or explanation, leaving Noam alone with his confusion and growing hunger. In the solitude of the chamber, Noam repeatedly played the melody in his mind, desperately trying to recall where he had learned it. His mother's face floated in his memory, her gentle features framed by dark hair, her voice sweet and low as she sang him to sleep during those nights when hunger made rest impossible. She had been a woman of few words but endless lullabies, teaching him to coax music from the simplest objects before giving him the flute on her deathbed. Yet she had never spoken of nobility or royal connections. If anything, she had taught him to avoid the attention of those in power. Each time he mentally traced the pattern of notes, tears welled unexpectedly in his eyes without explanation. Something within him responded to the melody as though it were encoded in his very blood, a birthright rather than a lesson. When he attempted to play a fragment on his flute, the suspicious steward snapped at him to stop, snatching the instrument away and placing it on a high shelf beyond his reach. Back in the great hall, the king had ordered all castle doors sealed. Guards took position at every exit with strict instructions. No one was to leave without explicit royal permission. The feast had dissolved into tense clusters of nobles speculating in hushed tones, their earlier merriment replaced by apprehension. Servants scurried between groups, gathering fragments of gossip to trade like currency in the kitchens below. The king retreated to his private council chamber, summoning only his most trusted advisors. His face had aged years in mere hours, deep lines etching themselves around his mouth and eyes as he paced the length of the room. "I must know," he demanded, slamming his fist against an ornate table, "how a gutter child knows the sacred song of Galadorn's heirs, a melody buried with my firstborn son 13 years ago." His eldest advisor, a gray-bearded man who had served 3 generations of monarchs, shook his head slowly. "It is impossible, Your Majesty. The prince perished in the Eastern Tower fire. We recovered his remains ourselves." "Did we?" the king challenged, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or did we find what we expected to find amid the ashes?" The question hung in the air like poison gas, suffocating reason with terrible possibility. The suspicion growing in the king's mind was absurd, a fantasy born of grief and guilt. Yet it took root and flourished like a weed breaking through stone. The timing aligned perfectly. The lost prince would be exactly the boy's age now. The melody was known only to the royal bloodline, taught from parent to child for 10 generations, never written down, never shared with outsiders. And there was something in the boy's eyes, a particular shade of blue that haunted the king's dreams. Could this filthy child, raised in sewers and surviving on scraps, possibly be the heir to Galadorn's throne? The notion was simultaneously preposterous and terrifying. If true, it would unravel 13 years of carefully maintained order. If false, it represented a threat of different kind. Someone outside the bloodline had learned their most sacred tradition. Either possibility demanded immediate action. As night fell across the castle, candles were lit and guards doubled. The king issued orders for discreet investigations into the boy's origins, his mother, his past, anyone who might have known him before he appeared at the castle gates. Meanwhile, Brother Elton lay unconscious in the monastery infirmary, his breathing shallow, his secrets temporarily locked away behind closed eyelids. In his isolated chamber, Noam curled on the unfamiliar bed, stomach growling, mind racing. He had played his music for copper coins 1,000 times in village squares and tavern doorways. Never had it provoked such a reaction. Never had it caused a holy man to collapse, or a king to pale with recognition. Something profound had changed. He was no longer merely a survivor, but had become a mystery to be solved. And perhaps most terrifying of all, he was beginning to suspect that he might be a mystery to himself as well. That night, as darkness enveloped the castle in its silent embrace, the flickering shadows cast by wall-mounted torches danced like restless spirits across the stone corridors. Most inhabitants had retreated to their chambers, leaving only the occasional guard's footsteps to echo through the otherwise silent passages. In the eastern wing, Noam lay curled on his bed, exhaustion battling with hunger and fear to claim dominance over his body. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of melodies that seemed to call him home to a place he'd never known. The soft scraping of metal against metal roused him from uneasy slumber. Noam's eyes flew open as the chamber door inched forward, admitting a sliver of torchlight from the corridor beyond. His muscles tensed, ready to flee though there was nowhere to go. Instead of the intimidating bulk of a guard, however, a slender silhouette slipped into the room, closing the door with practiced stealth. A young woman in a simple servant's dress stood before him, her fingers clutching a small bundle concealed within the folds of her apron. Her hair was tucked beneath a plain linen cap, but a few chestnut strands had escaped to frame a face marked by a gentleness rarely found within castle walls. She pressed a finger to her lips, gesturing for silence. "My name is Mira," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "I've brought you this." From within her apron, she produced a small loaf of bread, still warm from the kitchen ovens. The aroma struck Noam like a physical force, causing his stomach to contract painfully with want. He hesitated only briefly before accepting the offering, tearing into it with the desperate efficiency of one accustomed to making meals disappear before they could be snatched away. Mira watched him eat, compassion evident in her gaze. When he had devoured the last crumb, she seated herself cautiously beside him on the edge of the bed. "I heard your music earlier," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the distant call of night birds outside the narrow window. "It made me weep, though I couldn't say why." Her eyes, illuminated by moonlight, searched his face with unusual intensity. "You played what no one dares remember." Noam swallowed hard, finding his voice. "It's just a song my mother taught me. Nothing special." "No," Mira countered firmly. "It is far more than that." With practiced caution, she reached into her bodice and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age and creased from frequent handling. When she carefully unfolded it, Noam found himself staring at a detailed portrait rendered in faded inks, a family scene depicting the royal couple with an infant. Beside them stood a strikingly beautiful young woman holding another baby, similar in age. "This is the former royal family," Mira explained, her finger tracing the figures. "The king, queen, and their legitimate son, who now serves as crown prince." Her finger moved to the second woman. "And this is Lyria, the king's beloved concubine, with her child, a boy born of forbidden love and royal blood." Noam felt his heart stutter in his chest. The woman in the portrait, with her delicate features, wide eyes, and gentle expression, was unmistakably his mother. He had never known her name, having simply called her Mama during their brief years together. The shock of recognition left him momentarily speechless, unable to process the implications of what he was seeing. "Lyria was a kitchen servant, like myself," Mira continued, her voice thick with emotion. "The king fell deeply in love with her, though such attachments are forbidden by royal protocol. When she became pregnant, the queen's fury was boundless. After the child was born, Lyria was banished from court, sent away in disgrace with her infant son." Noam found his voice at last, though it emerged as little more than a croak. "The king abandoned her? Abandoned us?" Mira nodded grimly. "The official story claims the child, your half-brother by blood, perished in a fire that swept through the eastern tower 13 years ago. A tragic accident, they said. But some of us who served in the castle then had our doubts. The timing was too convenient, coming just as rumors of the king's illegitimate heir had begun to spread beyond castle walls. The revelation struck Noam with the force of a physical blow. The blood that flowed through his veins was royal, the same blood that entitled the arrogant nobles to feast while children starved in the streets below, the same blood that had condemned his mother to a life of poverty and early death. His entire existence had been shaped by this secret, though he'd known nothing of it until this moment. "Your mother protected you by hiding in plain sight," Mira explained. She disappeared into the lower town, becoming just another struggling widow with a child, beneath notice, beneath concern. She taught you the royal melody as your birthright, perhaps as insurance should you ever need to prove your lineage. Noam's mind raced with fragments of memory. His mother's insistence that he practice the melody daily, her mysterious comments about his true worth, the way she would sometimes stare at the castle with an expression he couldn't decipher. It had all been preparation for a moment she hadn't lived to see. "Why are you telling me this?" he demanded, suddenly suspicious. "Why help me?" Mira's expression softened. "I was Lyria's friend. I promised her I would watch over you if anything happened to her." A shadow of grief passed across her features. "I searched for years after her banishment but never found you. When I heard your music today, I knew immediately who you must be." She reached out, retrieving Noam's flute from the high shelf where the steward had placed it. "This instrument belonged to the king in his youth. He gifted it to your mother as a token of his love. The royal crest has been scraped away, but if you look closely at the mouthpiece..." Noam examined the wooden instrument with newfound wonder. Indeed, barely visible beneath years of wear, the faint outline of a crown and falcon could be discerned, the emblem of Galadorn's ruling house. "The king recognized the melody instantly," Mira whispered, "and now he faces an impossible choice: acknowledge the son he abandoned, or silence the living proof of his greatest shame." Her eyes met Noam's with urgent intensity. "You must decide quickly what you want from this revelation: wealth, recognition, revenge, or perhaps simply the freedom to walk away with your life intact." Stunned by these revelations, Noam stared at the portrait of his mother. Lyria, he corrected himself, savoring the gift of her name. In her painted eyes he saw the same determination that had kept them alive through winters of near starvation. She had prepared him for this moment without ever telling him why. "I want," he began, but faltered, overwhelmed by possibilities he'd never dared imagine. Before he could finish, the distinct sound of armored footsteps approached in the corridor outside. Mira quickly folded the portrait, pressing it into Noam's hands. "Hide this," she whispered urgently. "Trust no one except Brother Elton and myself. The walls have ears, and not everyone who smiles is your friend." As she slipped toward the door, Noam made his decision. Royal blood meant nothing to him. He had seen too much suffering inflicted by those who claimed divine right to rule. But the truth about his mother, about his origins, about the melody that connected him to a heritage he'd never known, that truth deserved to be acknowledged. "I don't want a crown," he whispered after Mira's retreating form. "I just want justice for my mother." Whether she heard him or not, he couldn't tell. But as he concealed the portrait beneath his thin mattress, Noam felt something shift within him. The music that had flowed through his fingers now carried new meaning, not just a beautiful melody, but a declaration of existence. His very breath through the flute was proof that the powerful could not simply erase those they found inconvenient. For the first time since being dragged to the castle, he felt something beyond fear, a dangerous spark of purpose. The dagger sliced through the darkness with lethal precision, its polished blade catching a sliver of moonlight as it descended toward Noam's sleeping form. In the fraction of a second, between dreaming and death, Mira's warning cry shattered the night's silence. She hurled herself across the chamber, colliding with the shadowy assailant and sending them both crashing against the stone wall with a sickening thud. Noam bolted upright, disoriented and terrified, as the sounds of struggle filled the small room. The moonlight revealed the king's trusted advisor, Lord Aldrich, his thin face contorted with rage as he wrestled against Mira's desperate grip on his wrist. The dagger clattered to the floor, spinning across the stone tiles like a deadly compass needle searching for true north. "Run," Mira gasped. using all her strength to hold back the older but surprisingly powerful man. The passageway behind the tapestry. Go now. Noam scrambled from the bed, snatching his flute and the hidden portrait in one desperate motion. His bare feet slapped against cold stone as he tore down the hanging fabric depicting a royal hunt, revealing a narrow service corridor beyond. Behind him, Lord Aldrich broke free of Mira's grasp, backhanding her with enough force to send her sprawling. "Guards!" the advisor bellowed, his voice echoing through the castle corridors. "The prisoner escapes. To arms." Heart pounding like a war drum, Noam plunged into the darkness of the hidden passage, guided only by his fingertips against rough-hewn walls. The sudden clamor of armored boots and shouted commands propelled him forward, even as his mind raced to make sense of this violent turn. Someone had decided he was too dangerous to live, his mere existence a threat that warranted swift elimination. Mira appeared beside him, blood trickling from her split lip, her breathing labored. "This way," she whispered, taking the lead through the labyrinthine service corridors used by castle servants to move unseen through the fortress. Every intersection brought new decisions. Each footfall threatened to betray their position to the guards, now swarming through the main hallways. They ducked behind massive tapestries, flattened themselves against walls and alcoves, and froze in the shadows as patrols thundered past. When the immediate sounds of pursuit faded, Mira pulled Noam into a small linen storage room, barely larger than a closet. By the faint light seeping beneath the door, she examined his face with grave intensity. "Now you know too much," she said, dabbing at her bleeding lip with her sleeve. "They will kill you." For the first time in his young life, Noam confronted mortality not as the slow starvation he had always expected, but as the immediate, violent end sought by the powerful. Death had stalked him through winter fevers and summer droughts, through nights without shelter and days without food, but never before had it taken human form, wielding a blade with such deliberate purpose. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I'm nothing to them. I don't want their throne or titles." "It doesn't matter what you want," Mira replied grimly. "What matters is what you represent. Proof of the king's betrayal, evidence that might fracture alliances with neighboring kingdoms, a threat to the legitimate heir's unchallenged claim. Your blood alone makes you dangerous." Meanwhile, in the royal chambers, the king paced before leaded glass windows that distorted the moonlight into fragments across the floor. His expression wavered between fury and something more complex, a haunted regret that carved deeper lines into his weathered face. Lord Aldrich stood before him, blood staining his sleeve, eyes downcast in a performance of contrition that masked his calculating mind. "The boy attempted to escape, Your Majesty," he lied smoothly. "He attacked me when I brought him food. I had no choice but to defend myself. He is safely confined again." The king nodded absently, his gaze drifting toward the distant mountains visible through the warped glass. Something in his heart questioned the advisor's account, a nagging doubt that had been growing since the moment the boy's music had awakened memories he'd struggled for 13 years to bury. The melody haunted him still, echoing through the corridors of his mind like a ghost seeking justice. "And if his blood is my own?" the king asked quietly, voicing the question that had tormented him through the sleepless night. "If this child from the gutters carries the royal lineage?" Aldrich stiffened almost imperceptibly. "A possibility based solely on a peasant's tune, Your Majesty. Many street performers learn our traditions to earn more generous alms. The resemblance you perceive is surely grief playing tricks on your mind." But the king's thoughts had already turned toward redemption. For 13 years he had lived with the guilt of abandoning Lyria and their child to appease political alliances. The weight of that decision had hollowed him, stealing joy from victories and meaning from his crown. Now, fate had delivered a second chance, an opportunity to acknowledge a wrong and perhaps find peace in his remaining years. "Bring the boy to me at dawn," he commanded. "Alone. I would speak with him myself." Hidden in the tower bell chamber, Noam and Mira huddled among massive ropes and wooden gears, the highest sanctuary they could reach without venturing onto the exposed roof. The castle below them teemed with guards searching every corner, torch flames moving like fireflies through the courtyard. Dawn approached, painting the eastern horizon with faint promise. "What do I do now?" Noam whispered, clutching his flute like a talisman. For his entire life, survival had meant avoiding notice, blending into shadows, becoming invisible to those with power. Now, paradoxically, his only hope might lie in becoming visible in ways he had never imagined. Mira studied him in the gray pre-dawn light. "You must decide what you truly want. Not a crown, you said. But what then? Recognition? Compensation for your mother's suffering? Or simply to walk away with your life?" Noam stared at the flute in his hands, tracing the faint outline of the royal crest with his fingertip. His entire existence had been defined by hunger and cold, by constant struggle against forces too powerful to defeat. The revelation of his heritage changed nothing about who he was, and yet it changed everything about what might be possible. "I don't want revenge," he said finally, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I've seen what hatred does to people in the slums, how it consumes them until nothing remains but bitterness." He thought of his mother, who had never spoken ill of the king despite everything she had suffered. "But I do want respect, not as a prince. I know nothing of ruling, but as a person worthy of dignity. And I want the truth acknowledged, not for power, but because it's right." As first light broke over the castle walls, Noam made his decision. He would not flee like a criminal, nor would he cower in fear. He would face the king, not as a beggar seeking favors, but as the living testament to a truth too long denied. His weapon would not be a blade or an army, but the one thing that had sustained him through his darkest hours: his music. "I have to face him," Noam said, rising to his feet with newfound resolution. "Not in hiding, not in shadows. I'll use the only power I've ever had." Mira's expression shifted from concern to something like pride. "Then we must prepare. If you're to confront a king, you'll need more than courage. You'll need a plan." She reached for his flute. "This instrument speaks your truth more eloquently than any words. Use it, but be prepared for the consequences." Together they formulated a strategy as the castle below continued its frantic search. By daybreak, Noam understood the enormous risk he was taking. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt something beyond the desperate scramble for daily survival, a purpose that transcended his own immediate needs. He would play not for copper coins or amusement, but for recognition of a truth that could no longer remain buried. Whether it led to acceptance or execution, at least he would face his destiny on his own terms, with his mother's melody as both shield and sword. The great hall had been transformed since the previous evening's feast. Gone were the long banquet tables laden with exotic delicacies and silver platters. In their place stood rows of ornately carved chairs arranged in a semicircle, creating a space that more closely resembled a court of judgment than a place of celebration. Tapestries depicting the royal lineage had been hastily hung along the stone walls, an ostentatious reminder of the bloodline's unbroken succession spanning 8 centuries. By mid-morning, the hall had filled with an uneasy assembly. Knights in polished armor stood at attention along the perimeter, hands resting on sword hilts. Ladies of the court whispered behind jeweled fingers, their elaborate gowns rustling with each anxious shift. Courtiers and advisors clustered in tense groups, exchanging theories about the unprecedented summons that had roused them from their chambers. None knew exactly what prompted this gathering, but rumors of the previous night's disturbance had spread through the castle like wildfire. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a stone platform, stood the royal throne, an imposing seat carved from ancient oak and adorned with gold leaf and precious stones. The king occupied it with a rigid posture that betrayed none of the turmoil raging behind his impassive expression. His crown sat heavily upon his brow and his fingers drummed an erratic rhythm against the armrest. Beside him, the queen maintained a facade of serene dignity, though her knuckles had whitened from the force with which she gripped her ceremonial scepter. In the center of this carefully orchestrated display of power stood a solitary stone pedestal. Atop it rested a simple wooden stool, the very same one upon which Noam had been placed for mockery just one day earlier. The symmetry was not lost on those who had witnessed his humiliation. Now, the stool waited empty, a focal point for the tension that thickened the air like smoke. When the massive oak doors finally swung open, the collective intake of breath was audible throughout the hall. Guards escorted Noam forward, though they maintained a peculiar distance, not touching him, as though uncertain of their role in this unusual procession. The boy still wore his tattered garments, the same filthy rags that had provoked sneers and laughter from the assembled nobility the previous day. His bare feet left faint impressions in the rushes scattered across the floor. Yet something fundamental had changed. Where before he had shuffled with his gaze fixed upon the ground, now Noam walked with measured steps, his head lifted. His eyes, startlingly blue in his dirt-streaked face, surveyed the crowd with quiet assessment, neither cowering nor challenging. In his right hand, he clutched his flute with the practiced grip of a warrior holding his only weapon. Whispers rippled through the assembly as Noam approached the pedestal. Many had expected to see a prisoner brought in chains, not a child walking freely toward what appeared to be a performance rather than a trial. The incongruity heightened the tension until the very air seemed to vibrate with unspoken questions. Noam ascended the 2 short steps to the pedestal and seated himself upon the stool without being instructed to do so. This small assertion of agency, taking the seat that had been the instrument of his humiliation and claiming it as his own, did not go unnoticed. Several courtiers exchanged glances of surprise, while others leaned forward with renewed interest. The king raised a hand, and silence fell instantly across the hall. "You have been brought before this court," he announced, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the chamber, "to explain certain irregularities regarding your knowledge of royal traditions." Noam's gaze met the king's directly, an act of such audacity that several gasps punctuated the silence. Even accused nobles typically averted their eyes in the royal presence. This filthy boy from the sewers looked upon the monarch as though they were equals engaged in conversation, rather than sovereign and subject. "I will answer with my flute, if your majesty permits," Noam replied, his voice clearer and stronger than anyone had expected. Though soft-spoken, there was a quality to his tone that commanded attention, a natural dignity that seemed at odds with his ragged appearance. The king's brow furrowed slightly, but he inclined his head in reluctant permission. Noam lifted the instrument to his lips, and the hall collectively held its breath. The melody that emerged was unlike the one he had played the previous evening. This was a new creation, a composition woven partially from the ancient royal song, but transformed by Noam's own experiences. It began with halting notes that evoked uncertainty and fear, the musical equivalent of a child lost in darkness. Gradually, the tempo increased, the notes climbing in complexity and emotion. Each phrase told a story without words: the abandonment of a mother and child, the struggle for survival in the margins of society, the hunger that gnawed not just at the body, but at the soul. The music spoke of nights spent shivering beneath bridges, of hands bloodied from searching through refuse for scraps, of dreams deferred and dignity denied. Through it all ran the thread of the royal melody, a birthright denied yet impossibly preserved. As Noam played, his eyes remained fixed upon the king, transforming the performance into an intimate conversation between the two of them. This was not entertainment, but testimony, a musical deposition that laid bare truths too painful for ordinary speech. The flute became his voice, each note an accusation wrapped in beauty, each phrase a question that demanded answer. Tears welled in the eyes of several ladies of the court, though they could not have explained precisely what moved them so deeply. Nights shifted uncomfortably, suddenly conscious of times they had ridden past suffering without pausing. And throughout the hall, the uncomfortable awareness spread that the tattered child before them possessed something many of them, for all their wealth and titles, did not: authentic artistry born of genuine suffering. The queen's composure began to crack as the melody progressed. Her hand trembled almost imperceptibly, and those nearest to the throne could see the moisture gathering at the corners of her eyes, whether from guilt, recognition, or simply the power of the music itself. Even she was not immune to the emotional force flowing from Noam's simple wooden instrument. Lord Aldrich, standing near the throne with a barely concealed bandage on his temple from the previous night's struggle, watched with calculating eyes as his carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. His fingers flexed unconsciously, as though seeking the dagger that had been confiscated after his failed attempt on Noam's life. As the music reached its crescendo, something extraordinary happened. The king's stoic expression began to falter. Decades of carefully maintained royal composure cracked beneath the onslaught of emotion carried by those simple wooden notes. His eyes, the same startling blue as Noam's, glistened with moisture he could not entirely suppress. For those with the courage to look directly at their monarch, the resemblance between the boy and king became suddenly, startlingly apparent. The final notes of Noam's composition hung in the air like a question awaiting answer. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the manufactured quiet of courtly protocol, but the genuine speechlessness of collective emotion. In that suspended moment, the truth hovered between them, too powerful to acknowledge yet too present to deny. The king rose slowly from his throne, his movements deliberate as he descended the dais steps. The entire court held its breath as he approached Noam, stopping just before the pedestal. For a long moment, he simply gazed at the boy, searching his features with an intensity that suggested he sought answers to questions he had feared asking for 13 years. Then, in a gesture that shocked the entire assembly, the king turned his back on Noam and walked away. "Remove the boy," he commanded, his voice thick with emotion he could not entirely disguise. "Take him outside the castle walls." Guards moved forward, uncertainty evident in their hesitant approach. Noam remained seated, his flute now silent in his lap, his expression revealing neither surprise nor disappointment, only a profound understanding that transcended his years. He had spoken his truth in the only language he truly mastered. That the king chose not to hear it was painful, but not unexpected. As they led him away, Noam walked with the same quiet dignity that had marked his entrance. He had not won recognition, but he had accomplished something perhaps more significant. He had forced truth into the open air, where it could no longer be buried beneath royal decree. In the faces of those who watched him pass, he saw the dawning recognition that would prove more lasting than any official acknowledgement. The seed of truth had been planted. Whether it would flourish or be trampled remained to be seen. The haunting notes of the flute pierced the pre-dawn silence like shafts of moonlight through darkness. From atop the highest tower, where ancient bells hung silent in anticipation of morning, Noam's melody soared across the sleeping castle and beyond, reaching the thatched roofs of the village below, traveling across fields where peasants would soon rise to their labors, even touching the distant forest where woodcutters and hunters made their camps. This was no ordinary tune crafted for coins or entertainment. This was the forbidden royal hymn in its purest form, played with the absolute conviction of birthright. Each note flowed from Noam's flute like liquid silver, carrying centuries of tradition and memory. His fingers moved with instinctive precision across the instrument's worn surface, finding patterns his conscious mind had never been taught, but his blood somehow remembered. In the village below, windows began to glow with candlelight as townsfolk woke to the unexpected music. Heads appeared in doorways, faces turned upward toward the castle in puzzled wonder. Children tugged at their parents' nightclothes, asking about the beautiful sound that had drawn them from dreams. The melody touched something primal in all who heard it, a recognition of something ancient and profound that transcended their daily struggles. The castle guards stood frozen at their posts, spears and halberds hanging forgotten in loosened grips as they listened. Many had been born in the surrounding villages and remembered fragments of this melody from childhood, whispered echoes of a tune their grandparents had hummed while speaking of older, grander days. They understood neither its significance nor its forbidden status, but felt its power nonetheless. Noam played with his eyes closed, his slight frame silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The wind caught his ragged clothes and tousled his hair, transforming him momentarily from a starving orphan into something otherworldly, a vessel for a truth that refused to remain buried. The stone walls beneath his bare feet seemed to vibrate in resonance with his music, as though the very castle recognized the bloodline it was built to house. Inside the royal chambers, the king bolted upright in his massive canopied bed, sheets tangled around him from restless sleep. The music reached him not just through the leaded glass windows, but through memory and bone. This was the lullaby he had sung to his infant son 13 years ago, in quiet moments stolen from royal duties. This was the melody his own father had taught him, and his father before him, a sacred tradition passed from monarch to heir since the kingdom's founding. But this rendering held something his own never had, a raw emotional honesty that spoke of suffering and survival, of abandonment and endurance. The notes contained not just tradition but testament, a declaration of existence that could not be silenced by decree or denial. The king stumbled from his bed, not bothering with a robe, as he rushed to the balcony overlooking the central courtyard. From there, he could see the small figure atop the bell tower, backlit by stars and the first hint of approaching dawn. Something broke inside him, a dam holding back 13 years of regret and rationalization. The queen appeared beside him, her face pale in the fading moonlight. She had not bothered with her usual careful appearance. Her hair hung loose around shoulders, usually hidden beneath elaborate gowns and jewels. For once, she looked not like a sovereign, but like a woman confronting a truth she had helped bury. "He plays like his blood knows the way," she whispered, her voice catching. "Just as you said your line always would." Across the courtyard, windows illuminated one by one as nobles and servants alike were drawn from slumber by the irresistible pull of the music. Many emerged onto balconies or into corridors, following the sound to its source like pilgrims seeking revelation. Brother Elton, still weak from his collapse but determined, leaned heavily on a novice's arm as he made his way to the chapel's small terrace, his weathered face lifted toward the tower, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. "The sacred hymn returns," he murmured, as the prophecy foretold, when truth rises to the highest point to be heard by all. In the bell tower, Noam remained lost in the music that flowed through him. Each note felt like remembering rather than creating, as though the melody had always existed within him, waiting for this moment to emerge fully formed. He played not for revenge or recognition, but for acknowledgement of his mother's sacrifice, of his own existence, of a truth that power had failed to erase. The eastern horizon began to lighten, the first golden rays of sunrise touching the highest towers of the castle. As dawn broke over the kingdom, the music seemed to intensify, gathering strength from the growing light. Village dogs howled in harmony. Birds added their own songs in counterpoint. Nature itself seemed to recognize and respond to the ancient melody that had been silenced for too long. Inside the castle, the king moved with newfound purpose. Unlike his previous hesitation and doubt, his steps now carried the weight of decision. He descended the grand staircase barefoot, still in his nightclothes, an unprecedented breach of royal protocol that shocked the servants he passed. Behind him followed the queen, equally disheveled, and a growing procession of curious courtiers drawn by the commotion. The king did not head toward the bell tower to silence the music, as many expected. Instead, he strode directly to the great hall, throwing open its massive doors with his own hands rather than waiting for servants to attend him. The hall still bore evidence of the previous day's audience. The stone pedestal where Noam had offered his musical testimony stood untouched in the center of the space. One by one, nobles filled the hall, drawn by both the music filtering through stone walls and the unusual spectacle of their king in such a state of disarray. They found him not on his throne, but standing before it, head bowed as though in prayer or penitence. When he finally raised his eyes to address the assembled court, they saw what few had ever witnessed: their monarch stripped of pretense, naked in his humanity. "For 13 years, the king began, his voice rough with emotion, "I have ruled with a lie eating at the foundation of my reign." He paused as the music from the tower reached a particularly poignant passage, seeming to gain strength from its distant beauty. "I abandoned my firstborn son and his mother to protect alliances and appease those who claimed such a child would weaken our line. I declared him dead when he lived. I chose power over truth." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lord Aldrich pushed forward, panic evident in his expression. "Your Majesty, this public confession is unnecessary and dangerous. The boy is clearly a clever impostor who—" "Silence!" The king's command echoed through the hall with such force that even the most powerful nobles took involuntary steps backward. The time for such deceptions has ended. Listen." He gestured toward the music that continued to float through the air. No impostor could play the sacred hymn with such perfect memory. Blood remembers what the mind cannot be taught. Outside in the courtyard, servants and stable hands gathered, their faces turned upward toward the bell tower. Among them stood Mira, her eyes shining with vindication and hope. The entirety of the castle complex had awakened to the truth carried on notes of music, a truth that had survived abandonment, poverty, and attempted murder to rise with the sun. In a gesture that stunned the assembled court, the king lowered himself to one knee. The monarch of 7 provinces, defender of the realm, descended not in homage to a superior power, but in acknowledgement of his greatest failure. "This boy is my son," he declared, his voice breaking. "And everything I tried to hide now sings for all the world to hear." The music from the tower reached its crescendo as the sun fully cleared the horizon, bathing the castle in golden light that seemed to underscore the moment's significance. In that perfect convergence of sound and dawn, something irrevocable shifted in the kingdom's foundation, a crack in the edifice of power that would allow truth to flourish where secrets had once taken root. The great hall fell into profound silence as Noam entered, no longer escorted by guards, but accompanied by Brother Eltan and Mira. He walked with quiet dignity across the stone floor. 3 days had passed since his dawn concert from the bell tower, 3 days of furious whispers, political maneuvering, and a kingdom holding its collective breath. The gathered nobility parted before him like a reluctant sea, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Gone were Noam's filthy rags, replaced by simple but clean garments of undyed linen. His face, scrubbed of grime, revealed features that mirrored the king's with uncomfortable precision, the same prominent cheekbones, the same startling blue eyes that seemed to shift between ice and sky. His hair, cut and washed, showed its true color, not mud brown, but the distinctive auburn that had marked the royal bloodline for generations. The king awaited at the hall's center, still kneeling as he had been when he made his confession 3 days prior. Beside him, arranged on velvet cushions, lay symbols of royal inheritance, a circlet of silver set with a single sapphire, a ceremonial dagger with the falcon crest, and a scroll bearing the royal seal, presumably a formal recognition of legitimacy. The queen stood nearby, her face a careful mask that concealed whatever turmoil churned beneath. Noam stopped several paces from the king, clutching his wooden flute like a talisman. The instrument seemed incongruous against his clean appearance, a deliberate reminder of where he had come from, the last vestige of his life in the gutters. For a moment, father and son regarded each other in silence, 13 years of separation hanging between them like an invisible wall. "My son," the king finally spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed hall, "I offer what should have been yours by birthright. Name, title, inheritance. The royal blood that flows through your veins entitles you to stand among the noble houses as a recognized prince of the realm." A murmur rippled through the assembled court. For many, this was the first official confirmation of rumors that had spread like wildfire since the bell tower performance. Several elder nobles exchanged dark glances, clearly calculating the implications for alliances and marriages long arranged with the presumption of a single royal heir. The king lifted the silver circlet from its cushion, holding it aloft so it caught the light streaming through the high windows. "This was crafted for you before your birth," he explained, "commissioned in secret during those months when I still intended to acknowledge you publicly. It has waited 13 years to rest upon your brow." Noam studied the gleaming band, his expression impossible to read. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and steady. Not the hesitant whisper of a gutter child, but the measured tone of someone who had found certainty in chaos. "I don't want the throne." 4 simple words, yet they landed with the force of a thunderclap. Confusion rippled across the king's face, mirrored in the expressions of courtiers who could not comprehend refusing such an offer. Power, wealth, privilege. These were the currencies that drove the endless machinations of court life. That anyone would reject them seemed incomprehensible. "I only wanted to be heard," Noam continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled nobility who had once laughed at his poverty. "Not as a prince, but as a person worthy of dignity. He stepped forward, close enough now that only those nearest could hear his next words to the king. "You offer me a crown to ease your conscience. But I've seen what power does, how it builds walls between people, how it justifies cruelty in the name of necessity." His fingers tightened around his flute. "My music belongs to the people, not to the stone of your throne." The queen moved forward, her silk gown whispering across the floor. "You cannot simply reject your bloodline," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "It is your duty to accept your place." Noam turned to her with unexpected gentleness. "My mother taught me that duty comes in many forms. Hers was to protect me, even when abandoned. Mine is not to perpetuate systems that allow such abandonment." A collective intake of breath followed this implicit criticism of the monarchy itself. Lord Aldrich, hovering at the edge of the gathering with a bandaged head and diminished influence, saw an opportunity in the growing tension. "You see, Your Majesty, the boy reveals his true intentions, to undermine the very foundation of your rule." But the king silenced the advisor with a raised hand, his eyes never leaving Noam's face. Something shifted in his expression, a dawning understanding that transcended the political calculations that had governed his life. "What would you have of me then, if not your birthright?" "Justice," Noam answered simply. "Not for me, but for all those who live as I have lived. Hungry, forgotten, deemed worthless by those who rule them. My mother died because she could not afford medicine that costs less than the wine served at your feasts. That is the true crime that needs addressing, not my legitimacy." He knelt then, not in submission but in demonstration, placing his flute on the stone floor between himself and the king. "This instrument has fed me when bread could not. It has brought beauty into lives that know only hardship. It has more power to heal than any crown." In the days that followed, the story spread throughout the villages like wildfire. The tale of the gutter boy who made the king kneel and then refused the crown in favor of a wooden flute. Some dismissed it as fantasy, others as calculated political theater. But those who had been present in the great hall knew they had witnessed something unprecedented. Power humbled before principle, birthright secondary to basic humanity. Noam did not remain within the castle walls. Despite chambers prepared for him and servants assigned to his comfort, he returned to the marketplace and village squares, playing his music for children with dirty faces, for widows with work-worn hands, for the hungry who recognized themselves in his melodies. Where once he had received insults and the occasional copper, he now found respectful silence and genuine appreciation. The nobility, ever attuned to shifting currents of influence, began adopting his simple manner of dress and speech, though few understood the experiences that had shaped them. Young lords could be seen carrying flutes they barely knew how to play, attempting to capture something of Noam's authentic connection with common people. None succeeded. The alchemy that transformed his suffering into transcendent music could not be imitated by those who had never truly known want. No one dared call him Rat anymore, not when villagers whispered reverently of the boy who made the king cry. His refusal of power had granted him a different kind of authority, the moral standing that comes from choosing principle over privilege. Even those who had once tormented him now stepped aside when he passed, their mockery transformed to grudging respect. On the final day of summer, as golden light bathed the kingdom in honey-warm hues, Noam bid farewell to Mira and brother Eltan at the village crossroads. His few possessions were bundled in a simple cloth: his flute, a change of clothes provided by the castle, and a blank journal given by the king as a parting gift. He carried no royal insignia, wore no markers of his bloodline, and made no claims upon his heritage. "Will you ever return?" Mira asked, tears shimmering in her eyes despite her smile. Noam considered the question, gazing toward the distant horizon where unknown villages and towns awaited his music. "Not as a prince," he answered finally, "but perhaps someday as a man who has found wisdom worth sharing." He never spoke again of being the king's son, for in his heart he knew he was something far more significant, a child of music, of pain, of truth. His identity had been forged not in royal chambers, but in the cruel crucible of survival, making him uniquely qualified to bridge worlds that rarely intersected. His value lay not in his blood, but in his vision, the ability to see humanity where others saw only stations and ranks. And in the final note of his journey's song, Noam left behind a lesson that echoed through the kingdom long after his footprints had faded from its roads. True power lies not in controlling others, but in mastering oneself. Not in wealth that divides, but in art that unites. Not in the accidents of birth, but in the choices that define a life. Some said the king watched his son's departure from the highest tower, a solitary figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Others claimed he had already commissioned a statue depicting a boy with a flute to stand in the central square as a permanent reminder of moral courage. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between legend and reality, just as Noam himself existed in the space between prince and pauper, belonging fully to neither world, yet transforming both with his passage. The melody of his life continued, carrying him toward horizons unknown, one step, one note, one truth at a time. Noam's journey reminds us that true power isn't found in crowns or castles, but in the courage to remain true to ourselves when the world offers us everything we never had. His music, born from suffering yet transcending into beauty, changed a kingdom not through force, but through honest expression. Would you have the strength to refuse a throne if accepting it meant betraying who you truly are? Could you forgive those who abandoned you, not for their sake, but for your own freedom from bitterness? In a world that constantly tells us our worth is measured by titles and possessions, Noam chose a different path, one where dignity couldn't be granted by royal decree, but had to be claimed through living authentically. His story challenges us to examine our own lives. Are we playing music that feeds our souls, or merely performing the notes others expect? Are we using our talents to build bridges between divided worlds, or to secure our own comfort while others suffer? If this tale touched your heart or sparked reflection, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear its message. Stories like Noam's have the power to transform us when we listen deeply enough. Subscribe to follow more journeys that illuminate the human spirit, and remember that sometimes the most powerful note is the last one, the one that lingers after the music stops, changing us forever.